In the somber halls of the Beverly Hills funeral home, two worlds collided in a moment that would soon captivate the internet. As rain pattered against stained glass windows and the elite of Hollywood gathered to pay their respects to legendary actor Gene Hackman, no one could have predicted the shocking confrontation that was about to unfold between his grieving daughter and a social media influencer who had no idea who she was dealing with. Comment where you're watching from today, because you won't believe what happened next. The Westwood Memorial Chapel stood as an elegant sanctuary from the downpour that had settled over Los Angeles that Tuesday morning. Black umbrellas dotted the entrance as figures in dark attire made their way inside, their faces solemn in recognition of the cinematic giant they had come to honor. Gene Hackman, two-time Academy Award winner and star of classics like The French Connection and Unforgiven, had passed away at the age of 94, leaving behind a legacy that loomed as large as the cathedral ceiling above the assembled mourners. Among those arriving was Katherine Hackman, the actor's eldest daughter, who had maintained a private life away from Hollywood's glaring spotlight despite her father's fame. Katherine, with her father's unmistakable piercing gaze and dignified bearing, moved quietly through the chapel, accepting condolences with graceful restraint. Unlike her father, Katherine had chosen a career in environmental law, fighting corporate polluters with the same intensity her father had brought to his most memorable roles. Today, however, she was simply a daughter grieving a father, vulnerability visible beneath her composed exterior. As family members and Hollywood royalty filed into reserved seating, another arrival caused a subtle stir near the entrance. Alexis Morgan, known to her 2 million followers as Progressive Princess, entered the chapel with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her understated black designer dress couldn't quite disguise the calculated way she surveyed the room, phone clutched discreetly in her manicured hand. At 32, Alexis had built her brand on provocative political commentary and confrontational gotcha moments with conservatives, all packaged in glossy production values and razor-sharp editing. What most of her followers didn't realize was that Alexis came from old money, a fact she downplayed while positioning herself as a champion of progressive causes. Her presence at the funeral was no coincidence. Celebrity gatherings were prime territory for content creation, regardless of the solemn circumstances. "Can you believe how many Republicans are here?" Alexis whispered to her assistant, who nervously glanced around. Hackman might have played tough guys, but his politics were questionable at best. This is the perfect opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy. During a brief intermission as the organist prepared for the next musical tribute, mourners moved into the adjoining hall where refreshments were served. Katherine stood slightly apart, taking a moment to compose herself near a wall of family photographs that had been arranged to celebrate her father's life beyond the silver screen. It was then that Alexis, sensing an opportunity, approached. Her assistant trailed behind, smartphone partially concealed, but camera clearly engaged. "I loved your father's work," Alexis began, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby mourners. "Though I always wondered how someone who portrayed such powerful characters examining social injustice could have supported some problematic policies." Katherine turned, momentarily confused by the confrontational tone at her father's funeral. "I'm sorry. You know, his donations to certain politicians," Alexis continued, her voice taking on the practiced cadence she used in her viral videos. "It's just interesting to reconcile his on-screen personas with his troubling political alignments. Don't you think there's a disconnect there?" Several mourners nearby fell silent, attention drawn to the increasingly uncomfortable exchange. Katherine's face registered first surprise, then a flicker of the famous Hackman intensity that had intimidated directors and fellow actors for decades. "This is my father's funeral," Katherine said quietly, her controlled voice belying the grief and anger beneath. "Whatever point you're trying to make, this isn't the place." But Alexis, seeing engagement potential in the confrontation, pressed on. "I think it's exactly the place to examine a public figure's legacy honestly. My followers believe in speaking truth to power, even at moments like this. Your father represented an old Hollywood that perpetuated problematic systems while pretending to critique them." The whispered conversations around them had ceased entirely now. Steven Spielberg, who had directed Hackman in The French Connection 2, took a half step forward before being subtly restrained by his wife. This was becoming a scene, precisely what Catherine had hoped to avoid, and exactly what Alexis had aimed to create. "You clearly didn't know my father," Catherine replied, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "And you certainly don't know me. I'd appreciate if you would respect this day of mourning." "Those donations were from Franklin Eugene Hackman of Tulsa, Oklahoma," Catherine interrupted, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority that had made her one of the most feared environmental attorneys in California. "Not my father, Gene Allen Hackman. A simple fact check would have made that clear." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered mourners, but Alexis, committed to her confrontation, wasn't deterred. "Well, he certainly never spoke out against injustice when it mattered. His silence made him complicit in... My father established anonymous educational scholarships for underprivileged youth throughout his career," Catherine said, her voice never rising, but somehow filling the space. "He testified before Congress for arts funding in public schools, and he raised a daughter who has spent 20 years prosecuting corporate polluters." For the first time, Alexis hesitated, the practice script of her confrontation faltering, as she registered not just Catherine's words, but the shifting atmosphere around them. Several mourners had moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around Hackman's daughter. "I don't need to justify my father's legacy to someone who would ambush his family at his funeral for social media content," Catherine continued. "But perhaps you should consider that real activism rarely comes with a filter and sponsorship deals." The assistant behind Alexis lowered the phone, clearly sensing that this confrontation was not going to edit well into the kind of triumphant moment their channel thrived on. But Alexis, too committed to retreat gracefully, made one final attempt. "Your platform," said a deep voice from behind Catherine, "is apparently about harassing grieving families." The speaker stepped forward, Denzel Washington, who had worked with Hackman and remained a family friend. "I think it's time you showed some respect and left." As phones began to emerge from other attendees, the tables had turned. Alexis Morgan, who had come to create content exposing others, was now becoming content herself, and not the kind that would enhance her carefully cultivated image. "Perhaps," Catherine finally said, her voice measured but carrying clearly through the hushed room, "you should consider that there's a profound difference between speaking truth to power and ambushing a family in mourning. One requires courage, the other is simply cruelty masquerading as conviction." Denzel Washington, who had stepped beside Catherine, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Other Hollywood figures, directors, actors, and crew members who had worked with Gene Hackman over his 5-decade career, moved closer, creating not just a physical barrier, but a statement of solidarity. Alexis's assistant, Trevor, had completely lowered his phone now, his expression openly mortified. He had warned her that morning that a funeral crossing a line, but Alexis had been adamant. "The algorithm rewards boldness," she had insisted during the drive over. "Nobody goes viral by being polite." Now, as whispers rippled through the gathering and phones captured her discomfort rather than Catherine's breakdown, Alexis realized that algorithms also reward public falls from grace. Her mind raced, trying to salvage both the moment and her reputation. "I apologize if my timing seems inappropriate," she began, her voice adopting the careful cadence she used for damage control videos. "But my platform is dedicated to honest conversations about extracting content from other people's pain," Catherine finished for her. "My father spent 50 years creating art. What exactly are you creating?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable in its simplicity. Several mourners nodded in quiet approval. Martin Scorsese, who had directed Hackman in his final film before retirement, actually smiled. The same, small, satisfied smile he wore when an actor delivered exactly the right line reading after days of struggling. Before Alexis could formulate a response, an elderly woman stepped forward from among the family members. Hackman's sister, Patricia, now in her 80s, approached with the deliberate pace of someone who had seen enough of life to be unintimidated by confrontation. "Young lady," Patricia said, her Midwestern accent undiluted by decades in California, "my brother Gene grew up in a broken home during the Depression. He dropped out of school to join the Marines at 16, lying about his age because he believed in service. The politics you're so eager to criticize were shaped by experiences you've only read about in history books." Patricia's voice quavered slightly, but her gaze remained direct. He wasn't perfect. Lord knows we fought about plenty over the years, but he lived his beliefs instead of performing them. The rebuke landed with quiet devastation. Alexis, for all her practiced poise in confrontational situations, found herself speechless. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to unfold. Where was the satisfying moment of exposure, the righteous vindication she had imagined? Instead, she felt increasingly like the villain in someone else's story. Trevor, sensing disaster, finally intervened. "We should go," he murmured, touching Alexis's elbow. "This isn't—" He didn't finish the thought, but his meaning was clear. This isn't recoverable. But before they could retreat, Frances McDormand, who had co-starred with Hackman in 3 films, stepped forward. Unlike the others, her expression held more curiosity than condemnation. "I'm interested in something," she said, her distinctive voice cutting through the tension. "What exactly did you hope would happen here today? Did you think his daughter would break down? That we'd all suddenly renounce our friend? What was the victory you imagined?" It was the most devastating question possible, not because it was angry, but because it was genuinely inquisitive. It invited self-reflection at precisely the moment when Alexis was least equipped to provide it. Alexis began, but for perhaps the first time in her public career, she had no prepared statement, no practiced talking point. The faces around her, not just celebrities, but crew members, childhood friends of Hackman's, industry professionals who had worked in his shadow, all waited for an answer she couldn't articulate. Catherine, perhaps sensing the impasse, finally broke the silence. "I think," she said quietly, "my father's memorial service isn't the place for this conversation to continue." She turned to address the gathered mourners. "Let's return to celebrating Dad's life and work, which is why we're all here." The natural authority in her voice, so reminiscent of her father's, prompted immediate movement. People began turning away, conversations resuming in hushed tones as they drifted back toward the main chapel. The protective circle around Catherine dissolved, though not without several backward glances at Alexis. As the crowd thinned, Alexis found herself suddenly isolated with Trevor. The confrontation had ended, not with a dramatic ejection, but something far worse: irrelevance. She had been dismissed from the narrative entirely. "We need to go," Trevor insisted more urgently now. "People are already posting. Twitter is ... Alexis nodded, her professional instincts finally reasserting themselves. Damage control required distance and time to craft the right response. As they turned to leave, however, Catherine's voice stopped them. "Ms. Morgan." Alexis turned, bracing for a final public rebuke. Instead, Catherine simply held out a memorial program. "If you're genuinely interested in my father's life and values, rather than just using him as content, you might want to actually learn about him first." As Alexis and Trevor made their way toward the exit, the weight of the program in her hand felt strangely significant. She had come looking for a confrontation, but had received instead an invitation to understanding. And somehow, that felt like the more devastating outcome. Outside the Westwood Memorial Chapel, the rain had intensified, sheets of water cascading from a leaden California sky that seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence within. Alexis stood beneath the awning, memorial program clutched forgotten in her hand, as Trevor frantically worked his phone beside her. "It's bad," he said, scrolling through notifications that arrived with increasing frequency. "Ryan Reynolds just tweeted about performative activism reaching a new low. He didn't tag you, but everyone knows. Meryl Streep's publicist just released a statement about respecting sacred spaces of grief," Trevor continued, his voice rising with anxiety. "Your mentions are flooding. We need a response strategy, like, immediately." But Alexis remained uncharacteristically silent, her gaze drawn instead to the memorial program in her hand. On its cover was not the expected professional headshot, but a candid photograph. Gene Hackman in his 70s, laughing with a young girl on a fishing boat, his famous intensity softened into grandfatherly joy. The child had to be Catherine's daughter, his grandchild, and the intimacy of the moment jarred against the public persona Alexis had tried to leverage for content. "Alexis, are you listening? Your follower count is dropping in real time. This could tank the sponsorship deal with Ethical Essentials if we don't control the narrative." His words finally penetrated her daze. The narrative, she repeated slowly, the familiar terminology of her professional world suddenly sounding hollow. What exactly is our narrative here, Trevor? That I ambushed a grieving family for views? Trevor swiped his rain-speckled screen closed in frustration. Don't do this now. We can debate ethics after we contain the damage. I'm thinking something about your intentions being misunderstood, how you were actually trying to honor Hackman's legacy by ensuring. The vehemence in her voice surprised them both. Trevor blinked rapidly, momentarily thrown off script in their professional relationship. For 3 years, he had been the voice of caution while she pushed boundaries. But he had never heard this note of self-recrimination in her tone before. Look, he said, adopting his most reasonable voice, what happened in there wasn't ideal. But we can frame this. Your followers will understand that sometimes speaking truth means making people uncomfortable. We just need to. My father died when I was 11. Alexis's words cut through Trevor's damage control like a blade. Did I ever tell you that? Pancreatic cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. Trevor stood motionless, rain beginning to spatter his expensive shoes as he stepped back involuntarily from the raw emotion in her voice. In 3 years of 16-hour workdays and constant travel, she had never shared this detail of her life. She looked down at the memorial program again, at Hackman's weathered face, creased with authentic joy. And I just did exactly the same thing to someone else. Before Trevor could respond, the chapel doors opened behind them, and mourners began streaming out, black umbrellas blooming like strange flowers in the downpour. The service had concluded. Alexis stepped deeper beneath the awning, instinctively avoiding recognition, but it was too late. Frances McDormand, emerging with her distinctive, purposeful stride, spotted Alexis immediately. For a moment, it seemed she might pass by, but instead, she changed course and approached, her direct gaze just as unsettling in person as on screen. Alexis felt a familiar defensiveness rise, then subside as quickly as it had emerged. I'm not sure what to say, she admitted, the simple honesty feeling foreign on her tongue after years of calculated messaging. Trevor shifted uncomfortably beside Alexis, clearly calculating the optics of this new exchange. But before he could intervene, more chapel doors opened, and Catherine Hackman emerged, surrounded by family members. Patricia, Jean's sister, held an umbrella over both herself and Catherine as they moved toward waiting cars. Alexis felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to approach, to apologize, to explain, to somehow make right what she had done wrong. But as she took an instinctive step forward, Frances placed a restraining hand on her arm. Not now, she said firmly. That family has been through enough today without becoming the audience for your redemption moment. The words landed with precision. Alexis froze, recognizing the truth in them. Even an apology now would be another form of self-serving performance, centered on alleviating her guilt rather than respecting their grief. As they watched, Catherine helped her elderly aunt into a Blacktown car, then paused before entering herself. Her gaze swept the gathered mourners, still milling outside the chapel, and for a brief moment landed on Alexis. There was no dramatic recognition, no visible reaction. Just a moment of eye contact across the rain-swept space before Catherine ducked into the vehicle and was gone. You know what I find interesting about you? Frances said, watching the departing car. You've built a career critiquing systems of power, but you've become a system of power yourself. 2 million followers, sponsorship deals, the ability to direct outrage like a weapon. She turned to face Alexis fully. The question is whether you're willing to apply the same critical lens to yourself that you so confidently apply to others. Most people aren't. With that, she nodded once in goodbye and moved away, leaving Alexis standing beneath the awning with Trevor, the memorial program, and a growing sense of disorientation. The rain continued unabated, but the chapel had nearly emptied now. Mourners dispersed to their cars or huddled in conversations that pointedly excluded her presence. We should go, Trevor said, breaking the silence. There's nothing more to gain here, and we need to formulate our response before... Before what, Trevor? Alexis asked quietly. Before people form their own opinions, before I have to actually confront what I just did? The drive back to Alexis's West Hollywood apartment unfolded in a silence as heavy as the rain drumming against the car roof. Trevor repeatedly checked his phone at stoplights, each glance followed by a barely suppressed grimace. The digital fallout was clearly escalating with every passing minute, but for once, Alexis couldn't summon the energy to care. The memorial program lay open on her lap, her eyes tracing over photographs spanning Hackman's 7-decade career and private life. "We need to get ahead of this," Trevor finally said as they turned onto her street. "HuffPost is already running with it. Social media star disrupts Hackman memorial. The Washington Post entertainment reporter is asking for comment." Alexis looked up from a photo of Hackman accepting his second Oscar. "Did you know he refused to attend the ceremony for his first win? Said he was filming something more important?" Trevor frowned, pulling into her building's garage. "That's not really relevant to our situation right now." "Maybe it is," Alexis said quietly. "Maybe understanding who he actually was matters more than who I decided he was before walking into that chapel." The car came to a stop, but neither made a move to exit. Rain hammered against the concrete parking structure, creating a cocoon of white noise around their conversation. "Look," Trevor said, his tone softening, "I get that you're shaken up. What happened in there wasn't what we expected, but this is still manageable. Your platform has weathered controversies before. Remember the senator's fundraiser last year? Everyone said you crossed a line then too, but a week later, everyone moved on to the next outrage," Alexis finished for him. "But did anything actually change, Trevor? Did the senator's policies improve? Did my bold confrontation do anything except boost my engagement metrics?" The questions hung between them, uncomfortably genuine in a relationship that had long been built around strategic calculations rather than soul-searching. Trevor's expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm. "This isn't like you," he said carefully. "Let's get upstairs, have a drink, and approach this professionally. The Alexis Morgan I know doesn't spiral into existential questions when there's work to be done." But as they rode the elevator to her penthouse apartment, Alexis wondered if the Alexis Morgan that Trevor knew, that her followers knew, was someone she had crafted so carefully that she'd lost sight of whoever existed beneath the persona. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and oddly liberating. Inside her apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the rain-lashed Los Angeles skyline. City lights blurred into watercolor smears against the gray backdrop. The sleek, minimalist space had been designed specifically to serve as a backdrop for her videos, neutral enough to not distract, expensive enough to convey the right image of successful progressivism. Now it felt like a stage set, artificial in its perfection. Trevor immediately moved to her home office, opening her laptop. "We need to draft a statement, something thoughtful but unapologetic. You are exercising your right to question power structures, even in uncomfortable spaces. We can acknowledge the timing was sensitive while maintaining that—" "Stop," Alexis said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying enough authority that Trevor's fingers froze above the keyboard. "Just stop." She moved to the window, watching raindrops trace chaotic patterns down the glass. For a woman who had built a career on having something to say about everything, she suddenly found herself without words. The image of Katherine Hackman's face, composed despite her grief, dignified despite the provocation, refused to fade from her mind. "That's the problem," Alexis said, turning to face him. "Everything is framed. Everything is positioned. Do you know what Frances McDormand asked me? What victory I imagined? And I've been asking myself the same question all the way home. What was I hoping for? That Katherine Hackman would break down crying? That I'd catch some famous actor saying something problematic so my followers could enjoy watching someone powerful squirm?" She sank onto her pristine white sofa, suddenly exhausted. "I can't frame this, Trevor. I can't position it. I ambushed a woman at her father's funeral because I thought it would make good content. That's the truth, and it's ugly." Trevor approached cautiously, as though dealing with someone in an unpredictable state. "Alexis, this isn't like you. You're having an emotional reaction, which is understandable after such a confrontational experience. But your platform is bigger than any single incident. Your voice matters to people who—" "My voice," Alexis interrupted, something hardening in her tone. "Let's talk about my voice, Trevor." When was the last time I used it to build something rather than tear something down? When did I last create anything except division and outrage? The questions weren't rhetorical. She genuinely couldn't remember. Somewhere along the way, her original mission of advocating for meaningful change had morphed into a performance of advocacy, one that generated plenty of attention, but increasingly little substance. Before Trevor could respond, Alexis's phone chimed with an incoming email. She glanced at it reflexively and froze. The sender's name glowed on her screen, Catherine Hackman. Trevor noticed her expression. What is it? More press? Wordlessly, Alexis opened the email, her heart racing with an emotion that wasn't fear of cancellation or strategic concern, but something more primitive, genuine shame. The message was brief. Ms. Morgan, I don't make a habit of contacting those who've chosen to make spectacles of private moments. However, something tells me you might be experiencing regret about today's choices. If that's the case, I'd be willing to meet for coffee next week. Not for a public apology or performative reconciliation, but for a genuine conversation about the line between activism and exploitation. My father believed in second chances. It was perhaps his most consistent principle. Alexis read the message twice, then handed her phone to Trevor, who skimmed it with widening eyes. This is perfect, he said, professional instincts immediately kicking in. We can document the reconciliation. Show your willingness to listen and grow. If we film the meeting tastefully, no. The word was simple but definitive. Alexis stood, taking her phone back from Trevor's hand. There will be no filming, no social posts about it, no public narrative. Trevor stared at her as though she'd suggested setting fire to her apartment. You can't be serious. This is a golden opportunity to transform the narrative from villain to someone on a growth journey. Your followers would... My followers aren't invited to this conversation, Alexis said with sudden clarity. For once, I'm going to have an interaction that isn't performed for an audience. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, patches of evening sky visible between dispersing clouds. Alexis turned back to the window, watching the city emerge from beneath the storm, buildings and streets glistening with renewed clarity. Something had shifted inside her. Not a dramatic epiphany, but the quiet recognition that she had been moving in the wrong direction for a very long time. I'm going to meet with her, she said, more to herself than to Trevor, not as progressive princess with 2 million followers, just as Alexis Morgan, who made a terrible mistake and wants to understand why. As the last of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing stars rarely visible through Los Angeles light pollution, Alexis made her decision. Whatever came next, whether redemption, rejection, or something in between, would happen off camera, in the genuine privacy of a conversation between two human beings trying to understand each other across a divide of their own creation. Sometimes, the bravest thing wasn't speaking truth to power, but listening when power had something to teach you about truth.